So yeah, it is.
You're going to pick up?
Yeah, I'll introduce you. The doctorate you did is JVPI?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Start.
So I talked to his Baji, she's here.
Perfect. Okay, great. No. Ready to go? Okay. Anyway, it's fine. All right, ready? Okay, all right. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. Thank you all for coming today on such short notice. I wanted to introduce myself for those of you who don't know. My name is Iqbal Akhtar, and I am an associate professor at Florida International University in Miami in the departments of religious studies and politics and international relations. And I'm very honored to be here in Pakistan. I'm here for about 5 months on a fellowship called the Fulbright Fellowship. And that facilitates connections between Pakistan and the United States. And part of the reason that we are here is to learn from scholars from other parts of the world, and also for scholars of Pakistan to be better understood and heard in other parts of the world. So the idea is that it's a dialogue, an academic dialogue to spur discussion and ideas. So we're extremely excited and very, very happy, not just to be hosted by UMT and Professor Pervez in the Department of Politics, but also to be part of the lecture series of Dr. Fatima Sajjad, who has launched the Center for Peace Studies and trying to decenter ideas of peace and conflict resolution, and to be able to especially highlight indigenous voices. And so we're very honored today to have Dr. Nirmal Baid, who is a great friend and especially an educationist. He's very passionate about developing educational ties, and he's also a scholar of Jainism as well. So he's originally from India. His family is originally from Rajasthan. He grew up there. He then moved to the United States. In India, he did a doctorate at the Jain Vishwa Bharati University in Lucknow. And so he has an expertise in Jainism and an interest in the Jain religion. And he'll talk a little bit about what Jainism is in the Jain tradition. But one of the very central tenets of Jainism is ahimsa, or nonviolence. And so he's going to talk a little bit about that and sort of thinking about the Jain tradition in an applied way. So Dr. Nirmal left India, went to the United States, and he has become very successful in his work. He works for Visa, but he's very dedicated to the study of Jainism and promoting that study. So he's part of a board in North America called the Jain Education and Research Foundation. And over the last 15 years, they have donated and created endowments, about 15 endowments, about $3 million total across universities in the United States to teach Jainism. So for students who are interested in the study of Jainism, to pursue those studies. And that's something else that we are trying to develop here in Pakistan with Punjab University, with UMT. If this topic is something of interest to you, and you would be interested in writing a paper on it or doing more research on it, then we are also then able to provide small scholarships to be able to do that sort of research. So that's something that we are interested in, kind of developing awareness and understanding of how do we think about not just the Jain tradition, but generally the indigenous traditions here in Pakistan about conflict resolution, and how do we create a more peaceful, a prosperous Pakistan that embraces sort of multiculturalism as well. So with that, we're very honored to, I'm honored to introduce Professor Nirmal Baid to give us a lecture today on the Jain tradition of nonviolence and environmental ethics. Professor Baid.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, and Jai Jinendra. Thank you, Dr. Iqbal, for that generous introduction. I really appreciate it, and Dr. Fatima for hosting. And most importantly, thank you to you all for investing your afternoon when I see there's a party going on outside for orientation that you could be attending. Instead, you're all decided to spend an hour with us learning about a tradition that you may or may not know much about. So before I get started, let me ask one question. Before coming to this lecture, how many of you had heard of Jains? Okay, 3. So it seems like it's a new tradition to you that I will probably spend a little bit of time introducing you to the tradition, and then we'll get into the nonviolence aspect of it. And the Jains have a very, very, very unique aspect of how they view the concept of nonviolence, and I will dive into that. So let's see. Should we? Okay, good. All right. So let's talk about some background. So in India, about 2,600 years or so ago, in the subcontinent, before everything was all one subcontinent. Well, is somebody going to flip that thing? Oh, okay, okay, all right. Yeah, you can build the slide. I think it's easy to that way. So at that time, there were 2 main traditions about 2,600 years ago. So one tradition was, let's see, maybe you can just hit and build the slide, might be easier. Yeah, just build the whole thing. That might be easier. Okay, all right, that's good. Yeah. So there were 2 traditions. One was a shaman tradition, and you might have heard about Buddhism. And then, Jains were at that time were not actually called Jains. They were actually called Nirgranth. And the word Nirgranth actually means, Granth means, I think the Urdu word would probably be like a gaunt, something that you tie yourself to. And they're going to consider somebody who doesn't actually have that, which means like they're pure thought process. So that's why that word was used. And then the other tradition was the Vedic tradition, which now somewhat known as the Hindu tradition. But back then there were no Hindus. It was called a Vedic tradition. And so Brahmins and Mimamsa and some of those were under that tradition. So there were two big streams of how the spirituality was developing. And the word shaman actually means seeker, meaning somebody who's actually seeking the path of knowledge. And shaman tradition led to the development of concepts such as the cycle of death and birth. You might have heard about reincarnation, those kind of things. And then how do you liberate? So moksha, if you've heard about that. So that's all came out of the shaman tradition is where it started. You can move. So what's the Jain lineage, right? So did it start at some point, or like who started it? So if you think about that, the Jains actually believe that the universe is eternal and it's governed by a time cycle, which means that there's always good time, and then slowly it becomes bad, and then it turns, and then it becomes. So there's a cycle of time that goes on, and in that cycle of time, there is a self-realization that certain people can achieve. And so there is not really a founder. There is nobody who actually founded the Jain tradition. But what we actually do, the way we think about it is that the people, there are certain people who can, through meditative practices and other practices, and they can purify themselves, and then they can pass on that knowledge to others. So that's in the recorded history. We go almost about 850 BC, who is one of our Tirthankar named Parshva was there at that time. And then the current lineage, actually, the knowledge that we have about Jain tradition traces back to Mahavir, who really revived the knowledge that we have today. So all our books and scriptures were actually compiled based on the teachings from Mahavir. And Mahavir's teachings, 2,600 years ago, there were not that much of writing in the subcontinent. So a lot of that was orally compiled after him, and then they became the scriptures. So that's really how we trace our lineage back to what we know about this tradition. Okay, next, please. Okay, so who are the Jains? So Jains are why we call ourselves Jains is because we are followers of Jinn. Not to confuse with the jinn. There is a word jinn in, I think, Islamic tradition also, right? Yeah, but this word jinn actually means victor. And victor means like one who has conquered all his enemies. So you might be like, okay, conquered enemies, that sounds very violent, right? What are you talking about? But the enemies are not external enemies. These are internal enemies. And the internal enemies we define in two different ways. One is attachments, and two is aversions. So the attachment is from sort of, you're trying to have greed and deceit as the elements that drive that attachment. And aversion is anger and ego. So basically, think about this: the deceit and greed actually drives what you are going to do. So you're greedy about something, or you want to deceive something, and you want to do some action. If you actually fulfill the action, then your ego goes up. And if you don't, then you become angry about it, right? So that is really the framework of the inner enemies, as we call them. And if you overcome and conquer those enemies, then you're a Jain. That's basically it. There isn't really anything else need to be done. Jains actually don't pray to any deities or anything. It's a non-theistic religion from that perspective. But rather, so if you go to a Jain temple, you'll see a statue generally of one of our founders, and that statue is actually from a temple near where I live in the United States. And it may seem like people are going to the temple and praying as they would pray in other temples, but the Jain belief is quite different. You don't really actually go and pray and ask for anything, because we don't believe there's anyone who will give you anything. So you are in control of your own destiny is really where the whole tradition starts. And that's kind of goes back to the conquering the inner enemies, because if you want to conquer the inner enemies, you got to actually work on it yourself. Um, and so these purified souls are the ones who actually expound the path of purification, and they are more of like revivers of knowledge as opposed to creators of knowledge. So next, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about the environmental ethics a little bit, because so first I want to introduce the environmental ethics, and then we'll see how Jains actually come into the environmental ethics, if that's okay. So what is environmental ethics? The environmental ethics, the definition I really like by Brandon, they say that it's a discipline in philosophy that studies the moral relationship of human beings. So, when you think about our entire ecosystem and environment, there is humans, but then there are others also in the environment. And how we define our relationship to what else is in there is actually the basis of how you build how you define the environmental ethics. And there are many ways you can go about it. So it's moral relationship of human beings too, and also the value and moral status of its non-human content. So how do you treat the trees? How do you treat the animals? How do you treat the earth? How do you treat the air? And now, as you hear more and more about climate change and all those things, we know that those things are important in how we treat the trees. And if we start cutting the trees, or if we are going to exploit the environment, then we know that there's going to be repercussion of that. So going with that, there are some fundamental questions about the environmental ethics that we got to ask, right? So the first one is that, is there a moral implication of harming the non-human contents of the environment? So humans, we consider ourselves the most powerful species in the environment. So what's the moral implication of harming the other elements? Like if we cut the trees, what's the moral implication? Not the physical implication, because we know the physical implication is that you cut the tree and we know that, we may get more greenhouse gases and this and that. That science actually explains that. But what's the moral implication of that, right? The second one is like, what's the moral relationship of human beings to the environment and its non-human context? So how do you define that relationship is really important. Are we consider them equal? Are we actually defining that we need to protect them, and so on and so forth? And then is there something inherent about the non-human that give them the standing on their own? And that's really important, because if the non-human elements can stand on their own, that is very different than humans actually recognizing what the non-human elements are and how do we treat them, because then we are in the position of superiority versus a position of equality. So that's the important part. Okay, so let's go to the next one. What are some of the prevailing thoughts from an environmental ethics perspective, right? Next, please. So the prevailing arguments are, and I selected some of them. So first one is like, can we just treat the nature as a system of resources that must be protected? And that's usually like you hear from science, like, hey, this is resources, we need to protect it. If we don't have enough water, then we got to protect it and make sure that we use it wisely and so on and so forth, right? So that's one way to think about that. Your ethics is based on a system of resources that should be protected. So if you don't protect them, then that's not an ethical thing to do. Then there's an argument that there was a theory that was developed called land ethics. So in the land ethics, where they basically said that land is a system of interconnected chains. What that means is that everything is interconnected, and if you're going to disturb something, then you're going to disturb everything else. So that becomes the basis for the morality, right? Then there was a new argument came, and that said, okay, all living things have inherent value, and hence they are equally deserving of respect. So we got to respect the trees because they are living. We got to respect the animals because they are living. So that becomes the morality, that if you actually don't respect that becomes an immoral thing to do. Then one argument came about the morality to be based on the capacity to suffer. Like if you cause suffering to somebody else or some other entity, then that's immoral. So that's another way to think about. And then the last argument that I found very fascinating is that granting moral consideration to humans only is completely arbitrary, because we think for ourselves that we are the most powerful, and hence we take the standing that we got to be moral and we got to protect them. So it becomes a relationship of us and them, but we know also that we are not necessarily the most powerful. that's because it's arbitrarily we have assigned ourselves to be the most powerful. And so I guess the question then is that, can we actually use any of these arguments to build an environmental ethics? So do we need a new, stronger basis by which each of the elements in our environment can actually stand on their own? And do we need a new ethics to be established? And in that ethics, what is the basis of that ethics? Why would a new ethics work? So that's where Jains present a new argument to say why we need to establish this and what is that basis. So we'll talk about that basis. So let's go to the next one. So before I jump into that, I'm going to talk about a little bit about what are sort of the core ideas of the Jains. So you a little bit have a better idea. I talk about a little bit of history in terms of how Jains came about, but this is more about sort of what are the core, should I say, principles or ideas, right? So the first one is ahimsa, or non-violence. You might have heard. I actually don't like that translation of ahimsa to call it non-violence, because this is why I don't like it. Is because when we think about violence, we think about something big has happened, right? Oh, there's a war going on, or there's something else, and violence is not like small things. And that's why the Jain concept actually goes into smaller things. It goes into the minutia of violence. So I like the translation that is non-harming, because when you think about harming someone, then you're a little bit more careful. Then you're like, because if all of us in the room, if somebody asks you, are you violent? I mean, we'll all say, no, we're not violent people. But do we harm others? Yeah, every now and then we probably, slip up and do something that harms others. So I think that's that I really like, and we'll talk a little bit more about into the etymology of that. The second principle is anekant, which is non-absolutism, and the third one is aparigraha, which is non-possession. So let's go to the next one. We'll talk about the other two principles first, the non-absolutism and non-possession, and then we'll dive deeper into the non-violence part of it. Okay. So non-absolutism, why do Jains care about non-absolutism? First of all, what is it? What is it is that when you try to describe nature or something, it's multifaceted, and you cannot really describe all aspects at all times. So what that means is that if I ask you, describe this sofa here, you might say it's black. Somebody might say, no, it's not really black. It's like grayish maybe. Or is it made of leather? Or is it, soft or hard? Or is it useful or not useful? I have three people, only one can say, there are multifaceted ways of describing it. And we're talking about one small inanimate object. But when you try to describe reality, it's much more complicated. So nature is multifaceted, and all these modes exist at the same time. It's not like we can say that, oh, sofa is black right now, but tomorrow it's soft, and then day after it's one person seat. It's all happening at the same time. And some may even appear mutually contradictory. And that's really the foundation of non-absolutism, is that when somebody is presenting an argument, there may be another argument that is describing the same thing and supporting the same argument as opposed to being contradictory. So I'll give you an example. Like, let's say if I described to you and said, I just saw a person with a knife in their hand, and they just stuck the knife in another person's stomach, and there's a lot of blood. But the person with the knife is actually a nice guy. Like, what would you think? You'll think like, I'm mad. Why am I saying that? But if I came and explained to you that that person is actually a surgeon, you'll be like, yeah, of course there's a nice person, because they're trying to help the other. So, but that's because you took the time to say, okay, you're describing a reality. Well, let me try to understand what's the other side of that argument. Why are you saying that? Or you could take an argument and say, okay, here's a bad person who thinks that, killing somebody is a good idea, or sticking a knife in somebody's stomach is a good idea, right? So that's really that. There is no way to express the truth in absolutes. You can only look at certain aspects of it. That's the idea. So the other aspect of this is the epistemological. So how you, yesterday we were actually having a discussion about various faiths, and what we found out was there's so much common among all the different faiths, right? whether it's morality arguments, whether it's how to live a better life, how to become a better person, a lot of the faiths say the same things. So you can look at the common things, or you can try to figure out what is actually contradictory, right? So the epistemological respect for the view of others, but however, like, it's not relativism. So that's the part I want to be very clear about, is that sometimes this gets confused that, well, anything goes then. Like, you can basically say anything you want, but that's not the point. The point is that when you describe the reality, you're describing certain aspects of it, but the truth of the reality doesn't change. So you might have all heard about the elephant story, where the 6 blind people try to describe what the elephant is, but the elephant doesn't change. The truth of the elephant is the elephant. But the way you describe, somebody says rope, that doesn't change the elephant. But that means that one aspect of elephant is actually a rope, which is the tail. Also, I think it emphasizes the limits of the ordinary knowledge. What that means is that in our ordinary knowledge and in ordinary thinking, we can't really take all the possible infinite aspects of the truth or a reality and express them all at the same time. And I mean, last point is that I think the reason this was developed, this whole, I mean, I'm only touching this, but this philosophy was developed, and there are hundreds of pages written on it, on how to think about this. The reason it was developed wasn't so that we can be all reconciliatory and all of that, but it was developed just so that when someone is trying to describe the reality, how should the others receive it? And that part is actually the important part of this. So let's go to the next one. Non-possession, it's one of the Jain traditions that actually is about what we do is we differentiate between your possession and your attachment to the possession. And the reason is because the possessions are not as harmful as your attachment to those is. Because you don't act just because you have things, but you act when you think you're either going to lose them, or you want more of them, or you have a strong attachment to them. So the renunciation, which is a common Jain tradition, and this picture is actually one of the Jain monks, and you can see that this person has literally 0 possessions. They live their life that way, basically. So so for ascetics, it's a vow of non-possession, and then for householders, people like us, it's limiting the possessions is really the idea. It also strengthens the argument about the interdependence of existence, because when you try to limit your possession, that means you're taking from the nature only what you need, and you're not trying to take more than what you need. And that's because everyone has a good chance of living a good life, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the next we're going to get a little bit into the non-harming, and then we'll go a little bit deep into that. So yes, please. There's a couple more. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Okay. So to understand non-harming, the Sanskrit word is ahimsa, and there is another word in Prakrit that Jains use, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. How do you think about harming? You have to really ask these 3 questions. One is that you can harm a living being. So you need to understand, like, what is living? What do you consider living? Because if you don't consider something living and you harm it, then there is no question about causing a harm. So you have to really understand what is living, and Jain's going to defining what a living is. And then second thing is that how do the living beings actually suffer? What that means is that what can I do, let's say even human to human, what can I do to you that will cause suffering to you? It's not, and that's why I go back to the talk about violence versus harming, because I don't have to kill someone to have them suffer. You could actually do even slight things and have people suffer. And so you have to understand, like, how do living beings suffer? And then third one is, how is the harm exerted to the living being? So what's the mechanism of doing that? And then combined together is how we define a framework for non-harm. Okay, let's go next, please. So first thing is living being, right? So Jains have a much broader aspect of who the livings are. And so first of all, we start with saying anybody or any object or any entity that has consciousness is living. That's it. So very simple. And then we define the living beings, which, and what I find fascinating is that 1 sense to 5 sense is a common thing these days. Like everybody knows that. But I don't know if you knew 2,600 years ago that there were 1 sense, 2 sense, and 3 sense, and 5 sense beings. So that's a fascinating contribution. The 1 sense beings are then further defined into earth, water, fire, air, and vegetation. So basically, the entire ecosystem, from a Jain perspective, is living. And I'm not talking about the animals or the insects that actually live in the earth, but earth itself is a living thing. And we can see that, right? You put a seed into the earth and it sprouts. Why? Right? The seed itself, if it's sitting on the ground, it's not going to sprout. So earth has got the energy or whatever you want to call it, but it's driving that force. So Jains consider all the living beings that possess life, that life is no different than anybody else. So our life and plants' life and animals' life, all the same. So that's how that. So it's a much broader aspect of how we define the living. Suffering. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Let's take this one slow. So all the living beings are endowed with what we call 10 vitalities. And I think it's easiest to understand the 10 vitalities if we consider it for ourselves, because we have all the 10 vitalities. And those 10 vitalities are the 5 senses. So we have the touch sense, the taste, speech, smell, and sight, and hearing. And then we have energy, which moves us. We have respiration, we all breathe. We have a lifespan, certain lifespan. And then we have a mind. Now, the reason these are important is because if you actually try to block any of those, that will cause suffering too. If somebody comes and blindfolds you without your permission, you'll suffer. We know that, right? Or any of these other things, or somebody cuts their lifespan short. Which means, you kill someone, or what have you. That's what all of these vitality causes a suffering. So all the living beings want to express these 10 vitalities freely. And if something doesn't allow that to happen, then we suffer. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. All right. So exerting harm. How do you exert harm? So now that we know that who the living beings are and how they want to live, just like how we want to live. We want to make sure that nobody, takes away our sense of smell or touch or our lifespan or anything. So the constituents of exerting harm are 2 things. One is if you injure to one of these vitalities. What that means is that you're actually blocking free expression of that. And the second aspect is the passionate activity that leads to it. So we have the activities that are we do day in, day out, and you do that activity with certain motivations, right? So let's think about in 4 different categories to understand this framework. The first is the stages of activity. So when we do anything, we can either be planning for it, which means we're only thinking about it. That's one stage. The second is you can actually be preparing for it, which means you're still not doing it, but you're preparing for it. And then the third is actually doing it. And then you could be motivated to do these things out of your anger, ego, greed, and deceit we talked about. And you can do these things through mind, speech, or body, because you don't have to actually do it. I can say something to you that would be very hurtful, right? And I can even think about saying something that could be hurtful. And then how you do it, because the accountability is, I talked about how Jains actually hold themselves accountable of your own actions. That accountability goes beyond you doing it. So if you do it, or you have somebody else do it, or you approve of somebody else doing it, all of them combined together are the ways that you can exert harm. So we actually go into the minute level of detail in terms of what actually is consisting of what we call nonviolence generally. Okay, please. So this is the word. Sorry, previous one, please. Yeah. So this is the word I was talking about. That the Jains actually have the word for ahimsa. Ahimsa is a more common word now, but our word is called Pranatipat. And what that means is the pran and atipat, which means the vitalities of the living beings, and actually to kill or hurt the living being, the vitality. So that word means that if you're actually going to do any of those things, meaning you take any of the vitalities and you injure that vitality for any living being, that is what we consider nonviolence. So pranatipat means causing the suffering or hurt any of the vitalities. Yeah. Okay, so then how do you actually live, right? If you can't do any of those things. So from a day-to-day perspective, what the way Jains describe these is from a three different perspectives. One is the subsistential violence, meaning if you're going to live, you still need to eat. You need to do your work. You need to do certain things. So that is the violence that's or harm that is caused by just sustaining life. Then second is self-defense. And then the third is intentional, meaning you don't need this to sustain, but you intentionally are causing harm. And so from a code of conduct perspective, the monks actually take the vows of not doing any of the harms, and the householders only not do the intentional. They're not allowed to do the intentional harm, but whatever is caused in the subsistence. Next, please. Okay, so this is really the perfection of nonviolence from our perspective, which is a Jain ascetic does not plan, prepare, or execute with anger, pride, or deceit or greed, by mind or body or speech, either himself or through another, or approve of committing any act which will injure any of the 10 vitalities of any living. So that's ultimate nonviolence from our perspective. And so when you look at this and you're like, okay, this is great, but how do I live now? Like, what do I do? So I think the important part to understand is that in order for us to fully understand nonviolence, we got to first develop the framework in terms of what is nonviolence, and this is the perfection of nonviolence. Now from here, it's up to you how much you want to deviate. So there are some who would say I will not deviate at all, but some would say I will deviate more, and so that decision is yours because you are in charge of your own destiny. So you take the idea of nonviolence and you fully understand and say, okay, I understand this is the idea of nonviolence. And then now I'm going to figure out how I want to lead my life. And that's really the important aspect, because there isn't really a prescription in terms of, well, if you do this, that's okay. You decide that. And you decide, and you're going to have, I mean, there are other aspects of, karma and so on and so forth that we're not talking about today. But whatever you do, you're ultimately going to be accountable for it. So this, I think, is really the important part from our perspective, that when you consider the entire ecosystem around to be living, and you have this idea of nonviolence, that I think is the ultimate ecology or environmental ethics that you can build on top of it. Because here, what you're saying is that all living beings are equal. And the fact that they are not to be harmed is not because you're superior and you're granting them somehow that, oh, I'm not going to harm them. So, it's like you're pardoning them or something like that. But it's actually that they have as much desire to freely express their vitalities as much as you do. So out of that is really you form the basis for this environmental ethics. Okay, let's go next. So I think maybe pause for a second. So I think that's as far as I was going to talk about from a nonviolence perspective. Jains today, I have a little bit in terms of just so you know, it's not a very we're a very small community. So maybe if you just maybe we'll just go through real quick. Yeah, there you go. So we have about 6 million or so. That's like 60 lakhs in worldwide. That's it. So it's a very, very small population. And there is about 120,000 or so in the United States. There are some in other countries, and so on and so forth. And you'll see a lot of Jains will have actually a vegetarian diet, and that's coming out of that commitment to the nonviolence. And I think we talked about the rituals in terms of meditation and so on and so forth. Yeah. Next, please. Okay. So from an environment perspective, Jains actually leave very little imprint on the ecological system and hold an affinity for the ideals of the environmental movement, because all the things that we are talking about, from protecting the environment, climate change, and so on and so forth, is all a lot of these values that we talked about are all coming back. Even though we're looking at more from a science and scientific perspective today, but the idea is the same, and it's how we have actually based our lives on, and we leave very little imprint. You'll see if you ever go to a Jain household and you see a spider, you'll see them putting the spider in a cup, nicely taking out, leaving outside, and so it's just part of life. On how we leave that very, very little imprint. Most of them don't do pest controls and things like that. So it's really how you live your life, but how you live your life in relation to rest of the environment around you. Usually Jains avoid professions and activities that are associated with violence. Okay, let's go to next. So one thing you may or may not have known is that the Indian freedom fight movement that was by Mahatma Gandhi. So there was a Jain sage named Srimad Rajchandra, who was really the guru of Mahatma Gandhi, and that's where he got the idea of nonviolence. And he adopted that in his diet and in his movement and satyagraha and all of those things that happened. And then of course we know that Gandhi's movement inspired Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and that inspired Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement in the United States. And then there were some other smaller movements in India about how you can live your life with some of these ideas. Okay, next please. Okay, so if you're going to remember 3 things about the Jains, these are the 3 things. First is, I think you've seen, and hopefully you can see that it's actually a radical way of thinking about nonviolence. It's not about not killing, which is of course there, but it's a radical way of thinking about nonviolence towards all. And that's really the important part, and all meaning the entire ecosystem that we live in. The second aspect is, as we talked about, that we are very small, but so numerically we are a very small community, but we've had immense impact on the world stage through the Indian freedom fighting movement as well as elsewhere. So that's a second aspect. And then the multiplicity of viewpoint is really an important contribution from the Jain philosophy to kind of think about and take that approach of how do I look at another person's viewpoint and try to understand that better. So next please. Okay, so this is what we say, Michami Dukram. What that means is that during my talk, if I may have offended you in some way, I actually seek your forgiveness, and I hope you will forgive me for that. Thank you so much for paying attention and listening. that from a spiritual perspective, and from a societal perspective, and I think that part of that is also that's one of the is also that you don't try to push your views of just to allow that also you can express your view and it's up to the person. That part is really important.
Telling us about because we get to hear a lot about Gandhi peace studies, but we don't hear about peace studies.
That's right.
So I think we should share ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that you absolutely. I think actually but it says that human rights and that most all the people.
I'm not really sure that I'm into this. I just I think there are other questions, but there must be
There is. Not really. Yeah, yeah. I mean, in some ways, like, at least we've seen in the United States, far more people because you know that, and in some ways, you can't agree. Exactly. Please. Yeah.
My question is a bit regarding non-violence. Yeah. The democracy things about peace and non-violence for students and they for realistic answer. According to them, that in order to avoid large violence, large-scale violence, they have to make small-scale violence. So, what would be your answer to this?
Well, so committing any violence is not acceptable. Okay, so I think you have to differentiate between the framework and what you actually do, because the framework actually is the guiding path, right? So framework is the guiding path, and that's how you know sort of what your North Star is, right? And then from North Star, how you want to deviate. So and the question you're asking is a philosophical question. It's not really it's one of those you might have heard about Western philosophy that there's a train going on a track, right? And you could actually have the train pull a lever and go on a different track that will kill only one person. Otherwise, it's going to kill 5 people. What are you going to do, right? So there isn't really. I mean, you have to decide what your answer is. There isn't a prescription for that. So I think that small-scale violence is for large-scale stopping large-scale violence is not necessarily an answer. At least from Jain perspective, it's not an answer. Yeah. Yes, please. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a great question, right? I will go back to the thing that whether you kill insects or not is a decision to be made, right? To save the human beings. And somebody's going to make that decision. You can make the decision for yourself. But there may be some people who won't make that decision. And that's okay too. Yeah. So okay. So if you're asking a personal question, let's see. What we do is in our house is we use the smoke to actually move the mosquitoes as opposed to actually spray to kill the mosquitoes. That's what we do. We may not have a dengue program in the United States, so it might be a little easier. But yeah. Absolutely. So look, I think that was one of the things I talked about, right? That there is substantial violence that will happen. The violence for you to actually sustain your life. So if the violence is in sustaining your life, because you can actually progress where you don't really need to commit violence even to sustain. Yeah. Yes. 100%. Lifelong. Lifelong. Yeah. Question is like, yes, actually, that's a great question too, right? Now, let me differentiate between sort of the current way of farming and the old way of farming, right? So in the old days, actually the farming was done where you go into a farm and you will not actually kill the plant, but you'd actually pick the thing and let the plant be there and live its natural life. So like in the fields, I remember, you guys know what bajra is?
Yeah.
Bajra. Okay. So my grandfather used to have a bajra field, right? And I remember that you have bajra grown, but they won't go with like a machine and cut the entire field. They'll go and pick those things. So you're not killing the plant. And in fact, for most of the vegetable based diet, you actually don't need to kill the plant. Like if you're picking an apple from an apple tree, you don't need to kill the apple tree, right? Now, there are some nuances. Let's talk about, since we're talking about diet, right? So there's a thing called Jain diet, right? In the Jain diet, it's vegetarian, but we also exclude certain types of vegetables. So like, for example, potatoes and onions and garlic is generally not found in Jain diet because those are root vegetables. And for root vegetables, pick the root vegetable, you actually kill the plant. You can't really pick a potato and not kill the potato plant, but you can pick a cucumber and not kill the cucumber vine. So, yes, Iqbal knows very well. Last night, he had to face us. Yes, please. Yeah. 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 Of course. Yeah. So I think, if you think about the three types of violence I talked about, right? There's the subsistential, meaning to sustain life. The second is self-defense. And then the third is intentional, right? So for us, intentional is not acceptable. Meaning like you can't go and commit violence on your own intention based on, greed or hatred or something like that. The other two are acceptable for a householder, but the monks actually take the vow of not committing any violence at all. So to your point, if actually somebody goes and try to kill a monk, they will not return. They will actually be like, okay, this is what it is. So little in number. Yeah, actually, that's a great question. I think there are a few things, right? Let me give a little bit more about sort of how our monks operate, right? Because generally, the following comes from preaching and so on and so forth. You go spread the message, others like it, so they want to become part of your message, right? So Jain monks don't travel in any transport; they only travel on foot. But that doesn't mean they're passive. It's not like, okay, well, I'm in Lahore, so because I can't take the car, so I will never go to Karachi. That's not how it is. they travel tens of thousands of kilometers in their lifetime. So they're traveling all the time, but only on foot. That does present some limitations, right, in terms of how far can you go, what you can do, and so on and so forth. So, like example, in Buddhism spread, even though Buddhism and Jainism, they are almost not only they are contemporary, they have similar message, fairly similar message, but Buddha's message is slightly different. And you see that a lot of Southeast Asia and China and so on and so forth actually that spread happened because of the monks traveling and so forth. So that's one of the reasons why. And then I think the other reason maybe to, I think some of the questions that came is that it's not an easy thing. It's not something that would be, yeah, I mean, it's diet and all the other things. That it's not something that you would just say like, okay, fine, starting tomorrow, I'll be a Jain. Like it's, right. So it needs a lot of commitment to sort of lead that life. And that may be part of the reason. I think there may be some other historical things as well. There's been some persecutions as well. I would say though is that at the turn of the first or the beginning of the first millennia, around or it might even actually be I think it was BC when Chandragupta Maurya was ruling the subcontinent. There were actually Chandragupta Maurya himself was a Jain. And in his kingdom, he had, I think, the largest kingdom of that time in his kingdom world, and Jains were the most prevalent faith at that time. So, obviously, it's a matter of research to figure out like exactly what transpired in the last 2,600 years or so. But there was a time when Jains were and Buddhists were in prevalence. I mean, even here in this region, that Lama and all that. But I don't know if the Jains came this far, like especially in the north. But they were quite prevalent in Chandragupta's time. Really good question. Yes.
It's not exercise that affecting bad habits. So, can you recommend some exercise that you practice, like mental exercise? I mean, whenever you do something bad,
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, one of the main practices of the Jains historically has been, I'm not talking about rituals and stuff now, but sort of the main spiritual practice has been is meditation. So Jains and Buddhists also are very advanced meditation. And so when you think about meditation, a lot of people are like, okay, you sit down in one place, you meditate on something, but what's the point of it? Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you sit in one place for hours and meditate? And what do you like? What's the idea, right? So the idea behind it is exactly what you're talking, which is being aware all the time of what you're doing. Like, a lot of times we actually sleepwalk through life, right? We do things, and then we're like, why am I doing this, right? And I think the minimalism we talk about is the same thing. Everybody's running and say, okay, let's collect, let's get more. Then you're like, okay, why am I doing this? Because it's not making me happy. So that awareness comes from meditation. And we were talking about this very topic last night. And if you are an experienced meditator, what you'll find is that when you become angry, the anger arises in the body first, then it comes in your mouth and face and whatnot and the words. It's not the other way around. Sometimes you think like, oh, because I'm angry, because I'm really angry, you start shaking. It's like it's the other way around. And if you're aware, if you have that level of awareness, you can see the anger arising, and you can do something about it before it's too late. Exactly. So that's like one of the things that actually a lot of Jains develop. I was describing one of the meditation places that I go to. It's a 10-day meditation practice that we do, and it's combined Jain Buddhist. It's now a lot of these things have become more sort of combined together. And every day you meditate for about 11 hours. Yeah, for 10 days. But it changes everything. It's not one of those things like, well, I don't know like whether this thing is there or not, like what can I get out of it, or but it actually changes, and it's something you actually experience yourself. And what the other thing that we also talked about is that the meditative practices are, I mean, a lot of the faiths actually have that as a common thread. Like you could, I was in Palestine at one point, and in Palestine there are caves where the Orthodox Christians actually use monks to meditate. They would go into these caves, and for a month at a time they won't come out. Right? So, and I think you have meditative practices in your faith as well, right? Yeah. So I think the meditative practices is the common thread, and the idea I think behind this is like, how do you create more awareness? And somebody was telling me yesterday that the Quran says that if you get angry, sit down, or something of that nature, right? Then you lie down, right? I mean, that's a practical thing. Now, whether you can call it meditation, or you call it Jain, or you call it Islam, whatever you call it, but as human beings, because as human beings, we know that we're not different. We're the same. We may have different beliefs. So as a human being, what happens to your body and how you actually react to it is very common. That's why you see these practices. Yeah.
But there are some others who are there to make resources, and they are not all of those from political sphere, and they are using their resources.
Yeah.
So this is kind of
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know the political aspect of it. That's not my area of expertise, so I can't really comment on it. But if somebody is causing harm to others, that's just not acceptable, no matter who it is. Yeah. Competition on economic grounds. That's a great question. Concept of competition. Yeah. So there isn't really a concept competition, because I think, as we talked about it, our focus is on individual. Individual is responsible for their own spiritual progression, and they're accountable for their own spiritual progression. So you're not doing that to compete with someone else and say, I'm a better monk than you, or I'm a better Jain than you, or I'm a better Muslim than you. That's not the idea. The idea is that how you progress yourself, and how can others help. So monks, for example, are helping actually the householders become better people. Yeah. Well, that's why I think he was asking that, why are you guys so small, right? If you were competing, you would be a more larger number probably, right? But the reason we're probably so small is because we didn't believe in competing with anyone, and maybe that's how it is. Yeah. Well, competent is different in competition. Yeah. All right. Yeah, a process to become monk. Yeah. Right. Good question. So the process is fairly straightforward, in the sense that once you decide to go that route, there you learn about the faith, you learn about the scriptures, you learn about the practices, and because the monk's life is much stricter than the householder's life, before you're ordained, you want to make sure that that's what you want to do, because it's a pretty tough life compared to even the householders. Yeah, there are a number of institutes where you go and you can start living as a monk without actually being ordained and practice and figure out if that's a path for you or not. Yeah.
And the element of technology and technology. Just moving to me that you mentioned for the environment more than ever.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you that how do you convince a world about benefit of plants,
Yeah.
which altogether gets twisted?
Yeah. So, so I think you know, at least you, this would have been probably harder 3 years ago. But if now, I mean, you don't even have to look at the Jains to say that what we're doing is actually harmful. You believe in any religion at all to even actually see the results of our actions, what we're doing, right? So the convincing is in the proof of what is actually happening.
Are there any movements which are, claiming or this thing, this movement change, or trying to change this?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, Gandhi, Martin, they had their enemy in front of them.
Right. Right.
Now, what do you do about this mysterious, unseen enemy?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do you convince the world?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think what we do generally for now, what we're doing is we're actually aligning ourselves to a lot of the other movements that are happening around the world. So like vegetarian movement or environmental movement or pollution and all of those things. So we're aligning with them, and then we're bringing sort of our learnings, and then bringing the scientific learnings and bringing them together. Yeah. Yes. There is a concept of afterlife, but there's no concept of God. So afterlife is basically, so there's a concept of karma, where based on your actions, you actually get the results of it, and then in your next life, you ultimately go through the cycle of life and death. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So so I think the core of what we do is about harming. So if you're not harming anyone, then it's acceptable from our perspective. And I think that's an important aspect. Now, it's more of a social question, perhaps, or than a spiritual question, perhaps. I think from our perspective, because if you harm, then it becomes spiritual for us. If you don't harm, then it's not a spiritual question. So that's really it's really a core tenet of how we evaluate things, and in some ways it's actually very simple. You don't have to think too hard about things of how do I evaluate what's right or wrong, and it's actually very simple. And then you make the decision that, oh, it's wrong, but I'm still going to do it, and that's a decision you make.
Questions?
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, yeah. It's late in the afternoon. I didn't make you fall asleep, so that's an achievement in itself.
So I think one thing we may